Okay, hello everyone. This is Colin Cox, and this is the Week 7 audio lecture for English 1020. This week, I have a couple of stories I want to talk about. Primarily, King of the Bingo Game by Ralph Ellison. That's where we will begin. Puppy by George Saunders, and if I have an opportunity, Model's Assistant by Alyssa Nutting. I'll remind you, if you have not listened to last week's audio, I would strongly encourage you to do so. I talk about a lot of the terms and a lot of the characteristics you will need to understand narrative and storytelling in that audio lecture. So again, all of this information, it's in the textbook, but if you haven't had an opportunity to listen to that lecture, or if you listen to it, but some of the things I say this week are a little unclear, I would encourage you to go back and listen to that bit of audio. But I want to start today with the Ralph Ellison story, King of the Bingo Game. And this story, like a lot of the poetry that we read in the poetry unit, it is not just a story about what it means to be Black in the United States, but of course it's written by a Black author, Ralph Ellison. And I think what you might find is this story pairs quite nicely with perhaps some of the poetry of Langston Hughes or even Claude McKay, in particular when you think about some of the things I said in the poetry unit about Claude McKay offering some of these critiques of the utopianism of places like Harlem, and in particular the North, in comparison to the American South, and I'll talk about that a bit later. But where I wanted to start today, it's actually with perhaps a bit of commentary about the characters in this story, because we don't actually have a lot of characters, but I think focusing on those characters, thinking about and talking about those characters will help to clarify not only the narrative choices that Ellison makes, but also some of the themes and some of the larger symbolic considerations one might have when reading and thinking about this story. So let's actually start with the bingo caller instead of the bingo king. So what we learn about the bingo caller, unlike the bingo king and presumably a lot of the people in the crowd at this movie theater that then becomes this bingo hall, he is white. And I think this is important because he certainly operates as something of an authority figure in this story. You could even perhaps use language like enforcer, because he's in many ways in a position of power and control over this game. And we'll talk about what the bingo wheel represents and how that might add a bit of texture to our understanding of the bingo caller as an enforcer. But I think this matters. But what I also think is important about the bingo caller, he doesn't necessarily occupy a real position of power. Now, obviously, it is a position of power. It's a relative position of power, but he doesn't have a lot of social authority necessarily. But I think one of Ellison's points, and one of the reasons why this bingo caller behaves the way he behaves, it's perhaps to bring to our attention, again, some of these power dynamics that exist between people of color and white people. How even you don't need to imagine, for example, that the bingo caller is the most powerful man in the world for him to assert a kind of power and authority and control over a Black man like the bingo king. And I think we actually see, and this is really subtle, but I think we see some of these power dynamics at play, in particular when we focus on some of the things he says early in the story to the bingo king. And so this is on 86. And what I've done, I've selected two quotes, one for each character that I think are perhaps emblematic of what someone like Ellison wants to do with these two characters. And this is on page 86, but after the Bingo King has won, or well, he hasn't won yet, but he successfully got a bingo and he's on the stage. But before he actually pushes the button to start the wheel, the bingo caller asks him a series of questions. And one of those questions is about where he's from, because he has a noticeable Southern accent. And in response to what the Bingo King says, the bingo caller replies, quote, "So you decided to come down off that mountain to the US." And I think what this does, it does a couple of different things. I think it brings to our attention, again, the sorts of cultural dynamics that we often associate with geographic regions, but I think this what would appear to otherwise be just friendly chiding still does the work of enforcing or establishing or reminding us of these power dynamics that exist between white and black people. At least I think if we wanted to just focus exclusively on the story during the time that Ellison dramatizes, but I think there's a lot about this story that's meant to feel universal, because the Bingo King doesn't really have anything to say in response to this. And I think Ellison's point, there is this way that the Bingo King is a bit naive at times, especially at the beginning of the story. But I think the question we would want to ask at this point is, well, what could the Bingo King say in response to this? Could he say something in response that's commiserate with what the bingo caller said, or is perhaps part of how we see these power dynamics dramatized? Is it possible that the Bingo King just simply couldn't say anything in response? And part of what the bingo caller has and possesses, part of his power, is his ability and his socially sanctioned ability to say what he said without any fear of recourse, or without the Bingo King really having anything to say, or not feeling as though there's a permission structure in place for him to say anything. So while we would probably focus a lot of our time and a lot of our analytical attention on the Bingo King, I think it's equally important to focus on a character like the bingo caller, because of how he certainly structures the expectations for a character like the Bingo King. And again, we should probably think about this as not just an individual, but in particular, because he's left unnamed, as someone who, at least in Ellison's hands, represents something much bigger, something, again, perhaps more universal, or again, perhaps there are larger and more far-reaching implications for what these characters ultimately represent. And again, I mentioned the Bingo King a moment ago. Let's talk about him now. So what's important first to say or acknowledge about the Bingo King is he's not just a character in a story, but he really helps to structure the narrative point of view in the story. Because even though this is a third-person narrator, it is something of a limited third-person narrator because of just how close this narrator is to the Bingo King. We, in many ways, the narrative point of view, Ellison filters it through the Bingo King, which is why we have access at times to his thoughts and feelings, because again, it's not first person, but it is something akin to a third person intimate, because we are close to the Bingo King. And initially, and I'll talk about the introduction to the story in just a few minutes, but initially the Bingo King, he's a down on his luck sort of character. We know that he doesn't have any money. He's in a foreign place, so for those reasons, he both lacks any literal capital, which would afford him certain opportunities, but he also lacks figurative capital. He's not from the North. He's from the South. So he's in a foreign place. Many of the customs, and he speaks to this in the introduction, but many of the customs, the ways of behaving, the sorts of expectations he would bring to social spaces, he doesn't feel quite as comfortable bringing those expectations and those normative assumptions to this place, to this space, because it's foreign to him. And in that way, he is not only someone who feels foreign in this place, he feels a bit unmoored. This also has the effect of casting him, and I mentioned this earlier, as something of a naive character, because again, there are things he just fundamentally doesn't know about this place, but he gains, and we can talk about this a bit, because he seems to gain some knowledge and some understanding of how to interact in this space. He seems to lose some of his naivete while still retaining it, because you could almost imagine his unwillingness to release the button. It's this moment where he asserts power. He perhaps sheds himself of some of his naivete, but the thing that motivates him perhaps is a reflection that he's still retaining, or that he still retains some of this naivete. But I guess the point is, at the beginning of the story, he is something of a down on his luck character. We know that he has this wife, Laura, who we don't learn a lot about her, but I think what we do learn is that she is sick. She has medical bills, and part of the reason why he's doing this is to hopefully earn or gain some capital that would allow him to pay for her medical bills, get her medicine, etc. But also, again, just thinking about what literal capital does. It creates opportunity. That's what money does. It creates opportunity for all of us. But he's also a character who's perhaps defined by, or we could define him by, this dichotomy between fantasy and reality, which is to say, if we wanted to use two words that in a lot of cases are mutually exclusive to define this character, I think it would be quite appropriate to use words like fantasy and reality. And I think that also, again, all of this is connected to the way Ellison tells this story, the narrative point of view he selects. I spoke about this last week, that while the development of character, plot, point of view, themes, symbolism, etc., while they're all separate categories, they're all intimately connected as well, at least in the best sorts of stories. And I think here, again, if we're thinking about the Bingo King as a character who's defined by this dichotomy between fantasy and reality, that certainly helps to inform the way the story develops as well, because there are these interesting moments throughout the narrative where the story's narrator dips into these moments of fantasy. And you could even argue that all of the Bingo King's attempts to assert a kind of power and control is this attempt of his to retreat from the harsh reality of this world into perhaps this fantasy space where he has power, control, and agency. But we see these two ideas, fantasy and reality, constantly warring with one another in this story. And in just a moment, I'll talk about the end, because I think perhaps we could conclude that what Ellison asserts at the end is just the unmistakable power of reality. That even though I think fantasy has obvious power to it, there's something quite liberating about fantasy. For example, maybe what Ellison asserts at the end of the story is that for African Americans, for Black people in the United States, reality and the power of reality has this unmistakable force to it, something that not even fantasy can defeat. But Another thing perhaps worth saying about the Bingo King is this gets me to the quote or the passage from the story that I think is perhaps emblematic or represents perhaps what Ellison wants us to think about this character in the best sort of way is this decision he makes to not release the button and what that ultimately represents about him. And again, if we just recognize that he is unnamed, perhaps what Ellison wants it to represent in a more universal way. And the quote, it's this moment, this moment of exultation when he shouts to the crowd, "This is God." And he's talking about the wheel itself. And again, I'll talk about the wheel in just a few minutes, but I think this is an important quote because what it is perhaps what it seems to acknowledge or what this moment seems to do for this character is to get him to a point where he can acknowledge that there are certain perhaps forces in the world, and it's whomever is in a position to wield and potentially control those forces. That's where perhaps the real source of liberation lies. And so for him to say this is God, I think it's also, again, when thinking about this declaration in tandem with what he does when he refuses to release the button, it's perhaps this acknowledgement that, well, if I can wield this, then perhaps I can create the conditions for a kind of liberation for myself, and I can move beyond this notion that I'm just fated to be a certain way. I can actually bend fate to my will and to my desire. And there are consequences for that, obviously, at the end of the story. But I think that declaration, "this is God," matters so much to this character because of what it seems to suggest about his place in the world, the lack of power, control, and authority he has, not over others, but really over himself, over his ability to determine what his life can be, what his life should be, etc. So with all of that said, I wanted to take a moment, and I've already said some of this, but I wanted to say a little bit about the way Ellison tells and structures this story. And again, I spoke a moment ago about how Ellison uses a third-person limited narrator, and this narrator sees the world, or this narrator is extremely close to the Bingo King, so we're perhaps seeing the world from the Bingo King's perspective. But what I also think is interesting is how, again, this story blends fantasy and reality, because the opening of the story, and this is on page 84, I think we're almost meant to feel just how sobering this reality is. This does not feel like something, for example, from a fantasy novel or even from someone's imagination. It almost feels like Ellison's just transcribing something he saw or even something he experienced. And I'll read directly from the first paragraph. And again, this is on 84, so follow along with me. "The woman in front of him was eating roasted peanuts that smelled so good that he could barely contain his hunger. He could not even sleep and wished they'd hurry and begin the bingo game. There on his right, two fellows were drinking wine out of a bottle wrapped in a paper bag, and he could hear soft gurgling in the dark. His stomach gave a low, gnawing growl. If this was down south, he thought, all I'd have to do is lean over and say, 'Lady, give me a few of those peanuts, please, ma'am,' and she'd pass me the bag and never think nothing of it. Or he could ask the fellows for a drink in the same way. Folks down south stuck together that way. They didn't even have to know you. But up here, it was different. Ask somebody for something, and they'd think you were crazy. Well, I ain't crazy. I'm just broke because I got no birth certificate to get a job, and Laura, about to die because we got no money for a doctor. But I ain't crazy. And yet, a pinpoint of doubt was focused in his mind as he glanced toward the screen and saw the hero stealthily enter a dark room and sending the beam of a flashlight along a wall of bookcases. This is where he finds the trapdoor he remembered. The man would pass abruptly through the wall and find the girl tied to a bed, her legs and arms spread wide, and her clothing torn to rags. He laughed softly to himself. He had seen the picture 3 times, and this was one of the best scenes. So again, I think what you'll notice if you're paying attention is this doesn't feel like something too dissimilar that perhaps any one of us might experience. Just a night at the movies, and especially if you are in a place that is foreign to you, feeling as though you don't completely understand, for lack of a better phrase, the rules of engagement. What sorts of things can I say to someone? What can't I say to someone? This looks like something I've experienced at home, but because I'm in a different place, I don't feel as though it is the same. So again, I think this brings to our attention a couple of things. First, it shows or suggests that the Bingo King, who we don't know him as that yet, but he feels perhaps a bit adrift here. And I mentioned this a moment ago, I think this offers, especially as you finish the story, this challenge to the utopianism that some writers and poets found, or at least wanted to construct when thinking about places like Harlem or just the North at large. This is something Frederick Douglass does in his autobiography. The North is, and let's be completely frank about this, obviously the North was better in a lot of ways than the South, especially the Deep South. But that does not mean that the North was this perfect utopia by comparison. I think we can see with figures like Claude McKay, and even in this story with Ellison, this attempt to show that yes, while it was better isn't the same as perfect. And I think we're seeing some of that isolation and alienation here. But I do think we get a sense, at least in this opening paragraph, of how important fantasy will be for this character. Because notice how he interprets what's happening on the screen. It's this moment where the main character, who we can almost assume without any hesitation is white, functions as a savior figure. And he really seems to enjoy this. We learn that he thinks it's one of the best scenes in the film. And I would encourage you to just pause for a second and think about why this scene would be so significant to this character. Well, you could argue perhaps it's because this scene perhaps mirrors or reflects how he wants to be and function as it relates to his wife, Laura. He wants to be a provider in that way. He wants to have the power and the agency to, quote, save her, much like we have the sense that this protagonist in this film will save this damsel in distress who's tied to the bed. So I think that's one obvious connection, but I think, and again, when we finish the story, I think these sorts of subtle references, the point of them become a lot clearer. This is a character with a kind of agency. He's watching this movie and he sees someone with power, with agency, someone who's in a position of control, and they can move. Notice that word, stealthily. They move stealthily through. It's as if they know how to navigate this space. They have a kind of power. So you can almost imagine that for the Bingo King, he's really self-actualizing in some ways as he's watching this movie, which is really quite interesting because I would argue a lot of us do the same thing when we watch movies or TV shows. We see versions of what we want to be. Maybe not what we are, but certainly versions of what we want to be projected in front of us. So I think this moment, even though, sure, it's doing the work of just establishing a location, it's doing the work of introducing us to a character, it also suggests some important themes and some of the more interesting and important dynamics to this story. And if we wanted to continue thinking about fantasy and reality, I would argue all we need to do is just read to the bottom of that page, because there's this moment when the Bingo King dozes off a bit. And here, again, this is where we're starting to see, again, Ellison play with form in interesting ways, because what we're seeing here, again, in comparison to the rather stark and unforgiving characteristics of this real space that he establishes, we're seeing something that feels more like dream, more like fantasy, and Ellison even reflects some of those sensibilities on the page with the way he deploys syntax or language in this moment. This is at the bottom of 84, and it spills over to the top of 85. The bottle gurgled again. He closed his eyes. Now, a dreamy music was accompanying the film, and train whistles were sounding in the distance, and he was a boy again, walking along a railroad trestle down south and seeing the train coming and running back as fast as he could go, and hearing the whistle blowing and getting off the trestle to solid ground just in time, with the earth trembling beneath his feet, and feeling relieved as he ran down the cinder-strewn embankment onto the highway, and looking back and seeing with terror that the train had left the track and was following him right down the middle of the street, and all the white people laughing as he ran screaming, and that's where it stops. So I think this moment is important for a couple of significant reasons, and one of the things that I would bring to your attention is just how, again, Ellison's language and syntax changes here. You'll notice after those opening two sentences, the remainder of the paragraph is just one big run-on sentence. So in that way, it's reflecting. Ellison reflects in form the content of this moment. We're meant to feel like this is a dream, and in the same way that our dreams almost feel like one just elongated sentence without any final punctuation mark, like a period or an exclamation point, so too does this. But this idea that something's chasing him and that he's the source of mockery. Again, I think Ellison does such a wonderful job of foreshadowing the rest of this story. The idea that he's a source of mockery is something that we see reflected later in the story. If you think back to what I said earlier about the bingo caller and those needling jokes he makes at the Bingo King's expense, we're seeing a bit of that here, but also this sense that this powerful force is chasing him, and that it's unrelenting, and that he seems to have no power, no agency whatsoever to stop it. This, you could argue, again, this is a way for Ellison to represent what it means to be a black person in the world. You constantly feel chased by this force that will eventually overpower you, and you have no recourse to stop it. And again, I think we see this reflected with some of the dynamics later in the story. So while all of the work Ellison does at the beginning of this story, it's meant to just create a world and establish a kind of narrative foundation, you can see Ellison doing some subtle work to develop some of the themes that become important later in the story. So because of time constraints, I do want to maybe jump around the story just a little bit to highlight a couple of important moments. Again, some of this I've already talked about, but when thinking about one of the bigger thematic conceits in this story, fate, free will, and determinism, I think we see this reflected symbolically in the bingo wheel and just the idea of a wheel and what it represents, the wheel of fate, for example, but also what it might mean to be the person who's ultimately in control of that wheel. Because notice, and this is on page 86, notice what he thinks to himself as perhaps he's just reflecting on the wheel and meditating on what it means. This is the middle of the page. He felt vaguely that his whole life was determined by the bingo wheel. Not only that, which would happen now, that he was at last before it, but all that had gone before since his birth and his mother's birth and the birth of his father. It had always been there, even though he had not been aware of it, handing out the unlucky cards and numbers of his days. The feeling persisted, and he started quickly away. I better get down from here before I make a fool of myself, he thought. And then on page 87, I have two additional quotes I want to read because I think these are all connected. As the wheel increased its speed, it seemed to draw him more and more into its power, as though it held his fate. And with it came a deep need to submit, to whirl, to lose himself in its swirl of color. He could not stop it now, so let it be. And finally, this is on page 89. Who am I? He screamed. Hurry up and bingo, you jerk. They didn't know either, he thought sadly. They didn't even know their own names. They were all poor, nameless bastards. Well, he didn't need that old name. He was reborn. For as long as he pressed the button, he was the man who pressed the button, who held the prize, who was the king of bingo. That was the way it was, and he'd have to press the button even if nobody understood, even though Laura did not understand. So with these three quotes, I hope I demonstrated the trajectory of the Bingo King's thoughts as it relates to this wheel. Initially, he's trepidatious. Then something else seems to happen. He's gained perhaps a greater understanding of what the wheel represents. And then finally, he starts to see himself as a kind of authority figure. And I think this is something of a liberating moment for him. But what I also think is interesting about it is this ethical attitude that I think's quite important. The ethics of disruption, because we operate and exist in a world, and you've probably heard this before, especially if you've worked in the service industry, which I have, but we live in a world where efficiency seems to matter the most, right? How many of you have ever heard someone say to you, do this? And even if they don't say it's because it's something to do for efficiency reasons, it's abundantly clear the reason they want you to do it is because it's efficient, right? Just be efficient. Be as efficient as possible. Everyone loves to talk about efficiency. But what I think is really interesting, in a world where everyone talks about efficiency, in a world where it seems as if none of us have any recourse to anything other than just being efficient, what's the ethical thing to do? Well, in most cases, especially if you find yourself in an exploitative situation, it can be self-destructive, but maybe the best thing to do is to say no. Maybe the best thing to do is to create some problems. And what's interesting about what the Bingo King does, he doesn't behave aggressively, he doesn't start punching people or turning over tables, he just does nothing. The ethics of doing nothing, of creating a disruption. And I think what we see in this moment is, again, this is something of a microcosm. This little world starts to just fall apart when he doesn't do his part, when he asserts a kind of authority, when he sees perhaps the ethics in disruption. But again, a specific and particular kind of disruption. Because notice, it's not his actions necessarily, because not releasing your finger from a button doesn't feel like an action, right? When you think about, and again, I think doing a bit of compare and contrast work here is useful. He's not acting in the way the protagonist or the hero in the film early in the story acts. He's not doing that. He's quite literally doing nothing. That's the ethical act here. So, because I wanted to be clear about this, it's not that he's, storming a castle or behaving violently. That's not what he's doing. He's simply choosing to do nothing. And I'm always interested in characters who, especially when they feel forced to do something, simply do nothing. They simply stand still, which in many ways is what he chooses to do here. And I've talked already about the sense of power, again, perhaps wielding and controlling his own fate, how all of that is connected to this decision. But I would also want to bring to your attention the deep sense of irony that operates in this story, and it's connected to a lot that we've already talked about. Fate, free will, determinism, race and racial dynamics. And if I haven't said so, I think this is, and you should know this just from reading the story, but what our Bingo King ultimately needs to do is roll a double zero, or spin, perhaps is a more accurate way to say it, a double zero, and that's how he wins, right? And so I think just initially the irony of double zero as victory, right? To be the hero, to be the victor, he needs to be a zero or a double zero at that. I think there's obviously a bit of irony there, but even at the end. And I asked you to address this in one of this week's discussion questions. How does he both win and lose? Because I think there's a deep sense of irony here, that he both wins and loses. And I'm reading from the end of the story. "I can't give it up," he screams. Then quietly, in a confidential tone, "Boys, I really can't give it up." It landed hard against his head. And in the blank moment, they had it away from him completely now. He fought them, trying to pull him up from the stage as he watched the wheel spin slowly to a stop. Without surprise, he saw it rest at double zero. "You see?" he pointed bitterly. "Sure, boy, sure, it's okay," one of the men said, smiling. In seeing the man bow his head to someone he could not see, he felt very, very happy. He would receive what all the winners received. But as he warmed in the justice of the man's tight smile, he did not see the man's slow wink, nor see the bow-legged man behind him step clear of the swiftly descending curtain and set himself for a blow. He only felt the dull pain exploding in his skull, and he knew, even as it slipped out of him, that his luck had run out on the stage. So, again, there's just several interesting layers of irony here. I think the obvious one, or one of the obvious ones, is that he landed double zero. So in theory, he won. He did the thing he intended to do, but it is also unmistakably clear that he's not getting the prize, So even when a black man wins, he still loses. That seems to be Ellison's point, is that even in these moments when someone like the Bingo King wins, it's a kind of Pyrrhic victory. It's a win that's tinged with a fair amount of destruction and loss. So I think considering how irony works in this story would be quite interesting. And those are two potential readings as a kind of entry point. So okay, I don't know if there's anything else I want to say about this story. If you liked this story, there's a lot of literature from this period that you may want to explore. Ralph Ellison also wrote a novel called Invisible Man, which grapples with similar sorts of themes and ideas. But if you wanted something quite similar to this, but something that perhaps feels a bit more resentful, angry, even forceful, you could always read Native Son by Richard Wright. The similarities between Native Son, Invisible Man, and this story are quite striking. So, okay, with that said, let's quickly transition to Puppy by George Saunders. I want to say a little about that story with the bit of time I have left. Again, I don't want this to go beyond an hour, so if you would, find Puppy by George Saunders. So, a lot of this story is quite simple, even though there are certainly elements of this story that are a bit complicated, in particular the presentation of the story, which is to say the narrative and how Saunders chooses to deliver this narrative, the way it's divided or bifurcated at times. But I'll talk about that in just a moment. When I say this is something of a simple story, what I mean is it's a story with two main characters, Marie and Callie, and they're in many ways fundamentally different characters, which that contrast, of course, helps to distinguish and differentiate them for readers. But part of what also makes it simple is that it's a story with this one moment, and Saunders, by pivoting back and forth from these two different perspectives, does the work of just circling around this one experience. And it's right there in the title. This is a story about Marie and her family traveling to Callie's home to hopefully adopt this dog, this puppy. And that's really what the story is about. But part of what I like about Saunders is how out of this rather banal situation, can you think of anything more common than, my family's going to get a dog today? These interesting themes and observations emerge. But I wanted to start by saying a little bit about how Saunders elected to write this story and why he may have done this. So this is a single story, and it uses third-person point of view, but you may have noticed these occasional breaks in the page, because what Saunders does that's quite interesting is at times we see the events from Marie's perspective or it's filtered through her perspective. So in that way, this story feels a lot like the Ellison story I also asked you to read. But then at other times, he does the exact same thing, or he adopts the same technique, but we see the story from Callie's perspective. And this kind of storytelling structure is something that we see, for example, in film. There's a movie called Rashomon that basically, I don't know if it necessarily invented this way of storytelling, but using a word like Rashomon to describe this has become a popular way of characterizing this narrative technique where, again, the whole events of the film or the story or the novel in question, it's filtered through these different perspectives. And in that way, we're just circling around that event. And as we see the story in question from these different perspectives and points of view, we as the reader or audience gain a deeper understanding of what's ultimately happening. And I think one of the best ways to test it or to check is to imagine just seeing this story from Marie's point of view, and how much of a monster Callie would seem. Because to really understand what Callie's doing with Beau, we need to have her input because, of course, Marie isn't privy to any of that. And to if we just saw, for example, the story from Callie's perspective, I don't think we would necessarily have the information we need to understand why Marie reacts the way she does, why she makes the decisions she makes. So, in that way, dividing the story the way Saunders does has the effect of providing perhaps more information, again, allowing us to see and understand that one single perspective is simply not enough to really understand the dynamics at play between these two characters. And in this story, we need them together as perhaps as odd they are as bedfellows. We must have them together. They are a package deal in that way for this story to really work. And I wanted to start by, now I want to transition and say a little bit about the characters, and I want to start with Marie because I think Marie is quite interesting. And one of the themes or the ideas that Saunders clearly wants to tease out with this story is just how socioeconomics and where any or all of us might fall on a socioeconomic scale or spectrum, how that does the work of perhaps restricting our ability to empathize, but also how it prevents us from seeing and understanding fully the motivations of people who exist on a different socioeconomic scale, or if we just wanted to use the language of this story, how someone like Marie, who I think even though, we don't see her tax returns or anything, I think it's fair to assume that Marie is someone who sits comfortably in a middle to upper middle class socioeconomic space, and Callie, by contrast, is much, much lower, not even middle class. She seems, by contrast, perhaps a bit impoverished. Her life is certainly not as easy or comfortable as Marie's from a socioeconomic perspective. And again, I think part of what Saunders wants to bring to our attention is how the motivations, again, how Callie's motivations, they don't seem like love to someone like Marie, or they don't seem like the projection or the consequence of loving someone. It seems like abuse. It seems like neglect. And notice how, in particular, when Marie thinks about Callie, she only has recourse to the worst sorts of stereotypes imaginable, that Marie is a bad, neglectful mother, that Callie is a bad, neglectful mother, when in fact, as Callie tells it, she thinks she's doing great. And it's not that she's just dumb or naive, considering the situations. Considering her situation and considering the particulars of her situation and the limitations or the limited resources she has access to. I think Saunders almost wants us to imagine that Callie doesn't have any better options. And I'll talk about this a little later, but I think that's one of the things we see at play, or one of the tensions between these two characters. And we have a clear sense of where Marie sits socioeconomically, really from just the beginning of the story. And so I want to read here from page 180, just the opening paragraph, and to really think about what this opening paragraph establishes about this family and, of course, Marie as a character. Twice already, Marie had pointed out the brilliance of the autumnal sun on the perfect field of corn, because the brilliance of the autumnal sun on the perfect field of corn put her in mind of a haunted house. Not a haunted house she had ever actually seen, but the mythical one that sometimes appeared in her mind, with adjacent graveyard and cat on a fence, whenever she saw the brilliance of the autumnal sun on the perfect, etc., etc., and she wanted to make sure that if the kids had a corresponding mythical haunted house that appeared in their minds whenever they saw the brilliance of the etc., etc., it would come up now, so that they could all experience it together, like friends, like college friends on a road trip, sans pot. Ha ha ha. So I think, obviously, Saunders, he's something of a satirist. He's trying to be funny here, and I think we can see some of his jabs, in particular with just the repetition of autumnal sun. And I think the impression we're encouraged to get from reading this is Marie is deeply invested in constructing these experiences for her family, and we see this a bit later as well. And in these attempts to construct these quote experiences for her family, she potentially misses a lot. I mentioned a moment ago how she obviously misses Callie's motivations or what may have motivated her to make the choice she made with Beau. But I think even with her husband, if you go to the bottom of the page, Robert, this is the final paragraph, she loved him for his playfulness. You could bring home a hippo you'd put on a credit card. Both the ferret and the iguana had gone on credit cards, and he'd just say, ho ho, and ask what the creature ate and what hours it slept, and what the heck they were going to name the little bugger. So I think here, so Robert obviously isn't one of our point of view characters. So we're left to ask whether this is an accurate description of him, and if there's any sense that what he says is, or if Marie's interpretation of what he says is perhaps inaccurate. And I'll leave it to you to decide what you think, but I would argue at least that Saunders does the work, especially on these first 2 pages, of suggesting that Marie is someone who is unreliable. We cannot potentially trust her interpretation of events. And we see this, of course, later in the story. But I think what we also see later in the story, and again, Saunders, he makes all of these interesting references, whether it's to the sort of car Marie and her family uses, or even the electronic toys and accoutrements that her family has, that she and Callie, they don't perhaps share some of the same economic anxieties. And we even have a sense of some of Marie's judgmental snobbery. This is on page 183. Well, wow, what a super field trip for the kids, Marie thought. Haha, the filth, the mildew smell, the dry aquarium holding the single encyclopedia volume, the pasta pot on the bookshelf with an inflatable candy cane inexplicably sticking out of it. And although some might have been disgusted by the spare tire on the dining room table, by the way the glum mother dog, the presumed in-house pooper, was dragging its rear over the pile of clothing in the corner in a sitting position, splay-legged, a moronic look of pleasure on her face, Marie realized, resisting the urge to rush to the sink and wash her hands, in part because the sink had a basketball in it, that what this really was deeply sad. Please do not touch anything. Please do not touch anything, she said to Josh and Abby, but just in her head, wanting to give the children a chance to observe her being democratic and accepting, and afterward they could all wash up at the half-remodeled McDonald's, as long as they just please kept their hands out of their mouths, and God forbid they should rub their eyes. So a couple of things. When Marie thinks this situation is deeply sad, I would encourage you to think about what that even means for her. Because I don't think this is a moment where we are meant to read Marie as an empathetic character, but instead as a judgmental character. Notice, for example, that she wants, it seems, to encourage her children not to touch anything, but she chooses not to. Not because it would be rude, but because she wants to, quote, appear to be democratic and accepting. And only then at a McDonald's will they do what she thinks is completely necessary. And I think what this does, it has the effect of rendering people like Callie as deeply, deeply suspect. Perhaps even the sorts of people who are responsible for the complete degradation of our society. I think Marie is obviously wrong here, but I think these are the sorts of conclusions that Saunders wants us to draw about her. That this, and again, I think because this is a story that focuses on two women, two mothers, it's important to acknowledge as well that within our society, the responsibility for a mismanaged home, for a dirty or a filthy home, that responsibility and the consequences for not having that often fall at the feet of women. This is a situation where, and I think this is one of Saunders's more interesting points, it's not a situation where women are mischaracterized by the men of the world, which happens, but there's even this way that women they infight against one another. And I think perhaps what Saunders wants to suggest is that Marie has perhaps internalized some of these rules, lessons, ideas, and I would use scare quotes for all of those, and she's now deploying them as weapons against Callie, instead of imagining that Callie's situation is a reflection of a myriad of different things, and to just assume that it's her fault or her responsibility as an individual, separate from or independent of this larger society, this larger culture, country, etc., is perhaps a bit of a narrow interpretation or a narrow understanding of Callie's situation. And again, I think this is precisely what Saunders attempts to dramatize with this story, the way all of those considerations which help to inform not just Callie's decision-making, but all of our decision-making, it's often ignored unless you're someone who has direct experience with those sorts of situations. And you could argue that it certainly culminates with Marie's reading of Beau outside. And if we haven't, or if I haven't said so already, and you should know this from reading the story, Callie has, in effect, chained Beau to the backyard, or again, in an attempt to keep him safe, because we learn early in the story that due to certain behavioral problems and a lack of resources, Callie doesn't really have any, or at least she feels as though she doesn't have any recourse. And in fact, and again, I think this is one of the grand ironies of the story, what she does, she thinks this is a prudent decision to keep her son safe. And the consequences, regrettably, will be, in theory, disastrous. Even though we don't see it, we know what Marie intends to do. And this is on page 184. The boy came to the fence. If only she could have said to him with a single look, life will not necessarily always be like this. Your life could suddenly blossom into something wonderful. It can happen. It happened to me. And I think this is important for a couple of reasons. First, and perhaps most importantly, it reveals that what Marie sees in this moment, it's perhaps not an objective assessment of the situation, but it's deeply subjective. She's really reading herself and her experiences into this moment. And because of what she reveals earlier in the story, the abuse she experienced from her mother, she's ostensibly mapping that onto Callie, which has the effect of rendering what Callie's done, whether you agree or disagree with it, it has the effect of rendering it deeply, unmistakably abusive. And who knows, maybe it is. But again, what I think is important here is how Saunders wants us to see that for someone like Marie, what she sees, even though she operates under the assumption that she has a clear, objective understanding, she knows the truth. There's this other part of the story that actually reveals the truth, or perhaps at best reveals Callie's motivations. And I think that's important too. And speaking of motivations, let's say a little something about Callie. And talking about Marie, it's gotten me to this a bit, but I think this is important. It's on pages 181 and 182. Here, Callie, she's thinking about Beau. When Beau got older, it would be different. Then he'd need his freedom, but now he just needed not to get killed. Once they found him way over on Testament, and that was across I-90. How had he crossed I-90? She knew how, darted. That's how he crossed streets. Once a total stranger called from the Hightown Plaza. Even Dr. Bryle had said it. Callie, this boy is going to end up dead if you don't get this under control. Is he taking the medication? Well, sometimes he was, and sometimes he wasn't. The meds made him grind his teeth, and his fist would suddenly pound down. He'd broken plates that way, and once a glass tabletop, and got 4 stitches in his wrist. Today, he didn't need the medication because he was safe in the yard, because she'd fixed it so perfect. He was out there practicing pitching by filling his Yankee helmet with pebbles and winging them at the tree. He looked up and saw her and did the thing where he blew a kiss. Sweet little man. So I think here, again, Saunders wants us to do a bit of compare and contrast work. Think about what Marie wants for her children, and perhaps what her freedom, what her social and economic freedom allows her to imagine and envision for her children. It's not the same as Callie. Callie, a best case scenario would be a world where Beau isn't dead. So I think here, again, this is something Marie obviously cannot see, that what Marie wants for her children, in theory, it's the same thing Callie would want for hers. But because of certain restraints, certain socioeconomic limitations, access to resources, etc., Callie just can't envision that yet. Even if you wanted to just think about someone like Maslow and his hierarchy of needs, Callie isn't even at a place where she could envision these wonderful encounters and experiences for Beau because she's just trying to survive. Furthermore, I think Marie's misreading of the tire on the table as, again, a signifier of Callie's neglect, a signifier of her inability to properly manage a home. Here we learn that it's not any of that. In fact, this is her attempt to properly manage a home, because apparently Beau, her son, has a tendency to slam his fists. So instead of a glass tabletop where he might harm himself, a tire is a better alternative. So again, even here, Marie's misreading of just Callie's lived space doesn't reveal the truth. Her reading of that situation doesn't reveal the truth. All it reveals is perhaps some of her class biases. I think that's perhaps the best way to describe it. And I think I want to finish talking about this story by talking about the end. Because again, I think here, Saunders renders Callie as such a remarkably sympathetic figure, and perhaps by contrast, Marie as something of a villain of the story, which I think if you asked Marie, hey, who's the hero, who's the villain? I don't think Callie's necessarily thinking about it in those terms, but I think Marie is. And I think Saunders perhaps is too. But his answer is certainly different from Marie's. He writes, when things got easier money-wise, she'd get some decent tennis shoes and start walking and get slim and start night school. Slimmer, maybe medical technology. She was never going to be really slim. But Jimmy liked her the way she was, and she liked him the way he was. Which maybe that's what love was. Liking someone how he was, and doing things to help him get even better. Again, I would pause here just for a moment. This is in complete contrast to Marie and her husband, I think you could say. Like right now, she was helping Jimmy by making his life easier by killing something so all she was doing was walking away from pushing the words killing puppy out of her head. She put it in her head, the words beautifully sunny day. Wow, I'm loving this beautiful sunny day so much. What had she just said? That had been good. Love was liking someone how he was and doing things to help him get better. Like Beau wasn't perfect, but she loved him how he was and tried to help him get better. If they could keep him safe, maybe he'd mellow out as he got older. If he mellowed out, maybe he could someday have a family. Like, there he was now in the yard, sitting quietly, looking at flowers, tapping with his bat, happy enough. He looked up, waved the bat at her, gave her that smile. Yesterday, he had been stuck in the house, all miserable. He'd ended the day screaming in bed, so frustrated. Today, he was looking at flowers. Who was it that thought up that idea? The idea that had made today better than yesterday. Who loved him enough to think that up? Who loved him more than anyone else in the world loved him? Her. She did. Okay, I think that's where we should stop for today. I'm well over 1 hour. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact me. Again, this is Colin Cox for English 1020. Have a wonderful day.